Welcome to Life Stories, where sometimes the most brutal betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from your own family, wrapped in silence, delivered with a smile. What if the person you spent your whole life trying to impress never once believed in you until the moment you stopped needing them to? This is the story of a brilliant woman who walked into her father's retirement gala not to celebrate his legacy, but to end her own silence. It's about the kind of love that feels more like a battlefield than a bond, and the moment you finally realize you were never the problem. If you've ever questioned your worth, if you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible to the people who were supposed to love you first, this story is for you. Take a deep breath. Let's begin. Ellie Morgan stood barefoot on the cold marble of her hotel bathroom, her reflection a blur of silken navy fabric and doubt. The mirror didn't lie, it never had. It simply waited for her to admit what she already knew: she shouldn't have come back. But here she was, in a five-star suite in Manhattan, rehearsing a speech for a man who had spent her entire life pretending she didn't exist. The gala was in 2 hours. Black tie, full press, slideshow reels, and standing ovations. A celebration of her father, Charles Morgan, the aerospace giant, the legend, the man whose name was etched into satellites and military jets across the globe. He had built his legacy from the ground up, brick by brick, accolade by accolade, and in his mind, his two sons were his foundation. Ellie. She'd been the blueprint he crumpled and threw aside. The gift box sat on the dresser behind her. Small. Elegant. Wrapped in midnight blue paper and tied with a silver ribbon so precise it felt like a thread. Inside was something that had once meant everything, a frozen fragment of the only time she'd ever felt seen by him. She had brought it here for closure, not sentiment. That, at least, was what she told herself. Ellie had flown in from San Jose under the guise of being the bigger person, but really, she needed to witness the end. She needed to know if anything had changed. Because deep inside, the woman who led engineering teams at NASA Ames and signed off on multi-billion-dollar propulsion systems, lived a 12-year-old girl still waiting for her father to say, "I'm proud of you." The knock at the hotel door startled her. She opened it to find her brother Ben, tanned, grinning, suited like a senator. "You ready to smile for the cameras?" he asked, already stepping in like he owned the space. "Depends on who's holding the lens," Ellie replied flatly. Tyler arrived seconds later, carrying champagne and that same dismissive charm he'd perfected since they were teenagers. The Morgan brothers, golden boys of the American dream. One a lieutenant colonel, the other a top-level contractor for Morgan Aerospace. Both minted in their father's image. "You bringing a date to Dad's coronation?" Ben asked, eyeing her up and down with a smirk. "Nope," Ellie said, pulling the zipper of her clutch shut. "Just trauma and mild indigestion." They laughed. Not maliciously, just the way people laugh when they don't believe you've lived anything worth mourning. That night, the Hilton ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers and curated nostalgia. Projectors played loops of Charles Morgan through the decades, shaking hands with generals, unveiling prototypes, commanding boardrooms. Ellie watched from the fringe, an outsider at her own family's mythology. There were no childhood pictures, no holiday clips, no trace of the daughter who'd once built a functioning model of the ISS from soda cans. It was as though she had never existed in his narrative. The MC stepped onto the stage. "Tonight, we honor a man whose vision reached beyond our skies, Charles Morgan." Thunderous applause. Her father emerged to cheers, his silver hair and steely composure the embodiment of legacy. Ellie's mother waved at her from the front table, a subtle gesture, a quiet plea. "Please stay. Please don't make this a scene." But Ellie wasn't planning a scene. She had simply come to give a gift. Quiet. Controlled. Final. Charles spoke with polish and charm. I've always believed that true greatness is passed down. My sons, Ben and Tyler, have taken the baton with pride. They are my legacy." A pause. Then, with a trace of soft condescension, he added, "And not everyone is cut from the same cloth. That's okay. Some choose different paths." It was the precision of the dismissal that broke her. He didn't say her name. But he didn't have to. Polite laughter followed, sharp as glass. Ellie stood. Every eye followed her. Her heels clicked across the ballroom floor like gunshots. She stopped just before the stage not on it and handed her father the box. "From your biggest failure," she said, her voice calm as ice. And then she walked out. She didn't cry. Not in the hallway. Not in the elevator. Not even when she reached the valet stand and handed over the key to her rented black Tesla. The night air bit her collarbone, and the noise of the city faded behind the hotel doors. In the privacy of the underground garage, she sat behind the wheel, hands motionless. The ache wasn't explosive. It was cold and quiet, like realizing the house you've been trying to build your whole life was never going to have doors that opened inward. Her phone buzzed. A message from Tyler. What was in the box? She didn't answer. Because she knew her father would open it. He'd wait until the crowd was gone, until the hotel room was quiet and he was alone with his legacy. Inside the box was a framed photograph, one taken at a small-town science fair 22 years ago. A 12-year-old Ellie stood beside her first homemade satellite model. Charles had been there, arms folded, distant until the judges handed her the blue ribbon. Someone had captured that fleeting moment, his hand resting on her shoulder, a genuine smile cracking through his usual granite expression. The only evidence she'd ever had that he once believed in her. Taped to the back of the frame was a handwritten note. "This was the last time you looked at me like I mattered. I spent 20 years chasing that version of you. I'm done now." Ellie didn't want revenge. She wanted release. And tonight, she'd finally unhooked herself from the idea that his approval was oxygen. Have you ever chased someone's love so long that you forgot to love yourself? What would it mean if the validation you've waited for your whole life never comes? He held the box. And for the first time in 40 years, Charles Morgan forgot how to breathe. What he did next would change everything. Ellie didn't return to her hotel that night. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the city that had once been her cage. The streets of Manhattan sparkled with the kind of energy that could swallow a person whole or spit them out stronger. She parked near the river just before dawn, cracked the window, and sat in silence as the skyline faded from black to indigo. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. Not from her father. Not from expectations. And not from herself. When she finally turned her phone back on, there were 57 unread messages. Most she ignored. But one stood out, not because of who it was from, but because of who it wasn't. No name. Just a number. It was a text with a single sentence. "I didn't forget that day. I just didn't know what to do with it." She read it 5 times before locking the screen. Her father. He hadn't signed it. Hadn't called. Hadn't begged. Just offered a truth wrapped in shame. She should have felt vindicated, maybe even triumphant. Instead, Ellie felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep cures, but the kind that burrows into your bones after years of being unseen. That afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the brownstone she grew up in. The porch light was still the same, the one that flickered during thunderstorms and never got fixed. Her hand hovered over the old brass doorknob before finally turning it. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish and the kind of silence that follows a storm. He was in the den. Alone. Sitting in his leather chair. And for a moment, Just a moment. He looked smaller. I wasn't sure you'd come, Charles said without looking up. I wasn't sure either, Ellie replied. The photo frame sat beside him on the coffee table, facing upward. That single image there, one sliver of something like connection, sat between them like a fragile relic. I don't remember the moment, he said. I mean, I know it happened. But I don't remember feeling proud. I suppose I did. But it didn't fit your version of who I was supposed to be, she finished for him. He nodded, slowly. You weren't like the boys. You didn't look for direction. You just went. Ellie sank into the edge of the couch, keeping her posture firm. I didn't want direction. I wanted recognition. That's not the same thing. Silence stretched between them. Then, the twist she hadn't prepared for. I tried to keep tabs on your work, he said. I read some of your white papers. The Mars Initiative. The radiation shielding system. It's beyond me, honestly. But I kept the articles. Ellie blinked. Why didn't you ever say anything? Charles hesitated, then leaned forward, elbows on knees. Because I didn't want to admit that I was wrong. That I misjudged you. That I didn't know how to love a daughter who didn't need me. That broke something in her. Not rage. Not relief. Just a fragile sadness too long ignored. I did need you, Ellie said, her voice low. I just needed you to see me without trying to fix me. You were always waiting for me to break so you could rebuild me into something more convenient. He rubbed his temples like the words physically hurt. I was raised to think emotions were a liability. That softness was weakness. My father never once said he was proud of me. I swore I'd raise my sons to be strong. To carry the name. And I wasn't part of that legacy, Ellie whispered. He looked at her then. Really looked. No. You are the legacy. You're just the part I never understood. It was the closest he would come to an apology. She knew it. And strangely, it was enough. But then he reached for a folder on the side table and handed it to her. Ellie opened it and froze. Inside were documents. Legal ones. Trust allocations. A draft letter of recommendation. Scholarship donations. All in her name. Some dated back nearly a decade. I never knew how to tell you, he said. But I never stopped believing in what you were building. I just didn't know how to walk beside you without getting in the way. She stared at the papers, overwhelmed. Why now? Why give me this now? He swallowed hard. Because I don't want to die with more regrets than awards. Ellie couldn't speak. Her throat tightened. Her hands trembled, not from anger but from the weight of everything she'd carried for so long. The distance she thought had been empty, it had always been filled with things unsaid. They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't brittle. It was human. What would you do if the apology came too late but still reached something tender inside you? And what happens when the person who broke you becomes the one holding the blueprint for your healing? Some doors don't slam shut. They creak open just enough to make you wonder what might still be on the other side. A week after that afternoon in the den, Ellie found herself standing in Terminal 4 of JFK Airport, her boarding pass tucked inside a copy of Scientific American, unread. She kept staring at the final message her father had sent the night before. It wasn't long. Just 4 words, I hope you soar. She hadn't replied. Not because she was angry, she wasn't, but because she didn't know how to say what needed to be said. What language do you use with a man who spent your whole life being your shadow instead of your shelter? Her flight was boarding. She hesitated at the gate, half expecting herself to turn around, to run back and finish a conversation that had been 20 years in the making. But some stories don't need final chapters. Some just need to stop bleeding. Los Angeles greeted her with the kind of golden light that made even the tired look luminous. Back at the NASA Ames facility, Ellie stepped into her lab and was immediately swept back into a world that made sense: graphs, equations, systems that followed logic, not emotion. But something in her had changed. The ache that used to follow her into every room was quieter now, more of a scar than a wound. Her keynote at the Women in Tech Expo was in 4 days. She'd been rewriting her speech obsessively. It had started as a technical lecture, then became a motivational address, then something deeply personal. But the final version wasn't any of those things. It was something in between: a reckoning. When she walked onto that stage at the expo, the lights didn't feel too bright anymore. The crowd, mostly young women, future scientists, engineers, dreamers, leaned forward in their seats, expecting formulas or career advice. But what Ellie gave them was a different kind of blueprint. "I used to think the hardest thing in the world was being underestimated," she began. "But it's not. The hardest thing is being invisible to the people who were supposed to love you first." There was a stillness in the room that only truth can create. My father was the kind of man who built rockets and reputations. He raised sons to be strong and a daughter he didn't know how to reach. I spent years trying to earn his pride like it was a scholarship I had to compete for. Until I realized that maybe he didn't withhold it to punish me, maybe he withheld it because he didn't know how to give it. She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "But that doesn't mean I was unworthy of it. And neither are you." The applause came not like a storm, but like a tide, growing, unstoppable, lifting her in ways no approval ever had. After the talk, Ellie stepped into the hallway behind the stage, her heart still thrumming. A young woman approached her, trembling slightly, her lanyard too big for her slender neck. "Miss Morgan," she said, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. My father left when I was 10. Never looked back. I thought it was because I wasn't enough. But your story, what you said, I think maybe I can stop trying to make that make sense. Maybe I can start building something that's mine." Ellie placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's the most important launch you'll ever make." That night, Ellie returned to her apartment in Silver Lake and found a package waiting on her doorstep. No name. No return address. Just her own written in block letters. She took it inside, cut it open carefully, and lifted the contents out. It was the photograph. The same one she had given her father at the gala. But something was different. The frame was new, sturdier, walnut wood. Behind the glass, the photo sat centered, clean, uncreased. But what caught her breath was what was now etched into the bottom of the frame in gold lettering. The moment I almost understood. She stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. There was a letter tucked behind it, handwritten in the same sharp, deliberate penmanship. "Ellie. Asterisk, I don't expect forgiveness. But I am learning to understand. You were never meant to follow in my footsteps. You were always meant to chart your own sky. Asterisk. Asterisk, if I failed to tell you that, it wasn't because you weren't worthy. It was because I was afraid. Of being irrelevant. Of being wrong. Of loving you the way you deserved and realizing I had no idea how. Asterisk. Asterisk, you became everything I couldn't see, but always hoped my children might become. I'm sorry it took me this long. Asterisk. I'm proud of you." No signature. She placed the letter back behind the photo, then stood in her living room for a long time, watching the way the setting sun threw fractured light across the wall. Later, as she sat at her desk, she opened a blank document and began typing, not a report, not an academic paper, but something different. A letter. One she might never send. One that simply said, "Dear Dad, asterisk, you were wrong about me. But you were also wrong about yourself, asterisk. Asterisk, you weren't incapable of love. You were just scared it might not survive truth. Mine did. Yours might still, asterisk." She closed the file without saving. It didn't need to be sent. She'd already said everything she needed to say on a stage, in a look, in a single step forward that had changed the direction of her life. Grief, she realized, doesn't only come when someone dies. Sometimes it comes when the version of them you spent your whole life chasing finally vanishes and what's left is something quieter, gentler. Something real. The next morning, she walked along the cliffs above the Pacific, wind in her hair, the roar of waves below like distant applause. She wasn't looking for closure anymore. She was building something better, peace. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of your own journey with someone you once needed to hear "I'm proud of you" from? If this story touched you, type 100 in the comments to let us know. And where in the world are you watching from? Share this story with a friend who needs it. Thank you for watching Life Stories.